I need to be completely honest about what happened at Eagle Crest Dam. I'm writing this while the details are still fresh, while I can still separate what I saw from what I've convinced myself I might have imagined. The difference between those two things gets narrower every day. I took the job in late October. The posting had been up for 6 weeks on a utilities contractor board, night shift operator for a hydroelectric facility in rural Colorado. On-site housing included hazard pay that was 40% above standard rate. In my position with $18,000 in credit card debt and a resume that ended abruptly with position eliminated due to restructuring, I couldn't afford to ask why the pay was so high or why the position had stayed empty for over a month. The drive from Denver took nearly 4 hours. The last 40 miles were the kind that make you check your fuel gauge every few minutes. A 2-lane highway that carved through progressively deeper canyon country. The asphalt cracked and patched, the shoulders dropping away into slopes of scree and skeletal pine. I passed through one town, if you could call it that. A gas station, a shuttered motel, a diner with 2 pickup trucks outside. After that, nothing but rock and sky and the occasional historical marker too faded to read. Eagle Crest Dam announced itself gradually. First the sound, a deep, almost subsonic hum that I felt in my sternum before I consciously heard it. Then the road curved and suddenly the canyon walls pulled back, and there it was. A massive concrete arc wedged between 2 sheer cliff faces, gray and brutal and entirely out of scale with anything natural. Above it, the reservoir stretched back into the mountains like a dark inland sea. Below, the river continued through a gorge so deep and fog-choked I couldn't see the bottom. I'd seen dams before. I'd worked around infrastructure my entire adult life. Water treatment plants, pump stations, underground valve networks. I understood concrete and steel, pressure and flow. But Eagle Crest felt different in a way I couldn't articulate. It looked less like something built and more like something that had always been there, wedged into the canyon by some geological violence humans had simply claimed credit for. The access road switched back down the canyon wall to a small parking area on the dam's eastern flank. The control building was built directly into the structure itself, a low, bunker-like attachment of cinder block and corrugated metal that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. Red warning lights blinked on towers at either end of the dam. The spillway gates loomed on the western side, massive steel teeth held just above the water line by machinery I couldn't see. I parked next to a battered Ford pickup with a faded utilities company sticker. The air was 15 degrees colder here than it had been at the canyon rim, and it carried a smell. Mineral-heavy water, concrete dust, and something else. Something organic and faintly unpleasant, like mud that's been undisturbed for a very long time. The door to the control building opened before I could knock. Marlowe looked exactly like his voice had sounded on the phone, weathered, economical, somewhere in his 60s with the kind of face that made you think of sun damage and decades of squinting. His eyes were deep-set and watchful. He didn't smile or offer his hand, just stepped back to let me in. Navarro? Yes, sir. Caleb. You're on time, that's something. He closed the door behind me, sealing out the wind and the sound of water. I've got 2 hours to show you everything. Pay attention. The control room was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet by 30, dominated by a console of monitors, readout panels, and manual controls that looked like they'd been installed in 3 different decades. Everything hummed. The floor vibrated faintly under my boots. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The far wall had a large window overlooking the downstream side of the dam, where the outflow churned white against dark rock hundreds of feet below. Marlowe's tour was brisk and efficient. He showed me the turbine readouts, the sluice gate controls, the emergency generator switches, and the logbook where I'd record flow rates and equipment status every hour. He walked me through the interior corridor, a narrow, echoing tunnel that ran along the dam's core, lined with pipes and conduits and inspection hatches lit by caged bulbs every 30 feet. He showed me the stairwell that descended to the lower gallery, though he didn't take me down there. He showed me the exterior catwalks, the upper platform with its view of the reservoir, and the downstream observation room with its thick glass overlooking the base of the spillway. "Your shift is midnight to 6 a.m., he said as we returned to the control room. "Hourly logs, equipment checks at 1 and 4. Alarms are automatic, but you confirm and log them. Phones satellite linked. Cell coverage is non-existent down here. The nearest help is 40 miles. Weather gets bad, you might be on your own for days." "Understood." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into a drawer beneath the console and pulled out a metal clipboard. Attached to it was a laminated sheet, the kind of thing you'd see in any industrial facility. Typed procedures, equipment codes, emergency protocols. "Night shift rules," he said, handing it to me. "Read them, follow them, don't improvise." I glanced at the sheet. The header read, "Eagle Crest Night Shift, Critical Operational Rules, 000600. The first few entries were standard. Rule 1. Perform equipment status checks at 0100 and 0400. Log all readings. Rule 2. In the event of a critical alarm, follow emergency shutdown procedures as posted. Then they got stranger. Rule 3. Do not shine any lights into the reservoir after midnight. Rule 5. If you hear someone speaking on the intercom from the lower gallery after 1:30 a.m., do not respond. No one is scheduled down there at night. Rule 7. Avoid crossing the exterior catwalk over the spillway between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m., regardless of alarms. Rule 9. If you see faces in the downstream observation window, step away. Do not tap the glass. I read through the list twice, waiting for Marlowe to crack a smile, to tell me this was some kind of hazing ritual for new operators. He didn't. He just watched me with those deep-set eyes, his expression flat. "Is this serious?" I asked. "Serious as a heart attack. Some of these don't make sense. Why would there be faces in the observation window? Why would—" "You'll figure it out," Marlowe interrupted. "Or you won't, and you'll leave like the last guy. Either way, those rules are there for a reason. They were written by people who worked this shift before you. People who learned the hard way." He glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. "I'm not staying past midnight," he said, already moving toward the door. "Your quarters are through that door. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, everything you need. I'll be back at 6 to check in. You've got my number if there's an emergency, but define emergency carefully." "Wait," I started, but he was already outside, the door closing behind him with a hollow metallic thunk. I stood alone in the humming control room, holding the clipboard, watching through the window as Marlowe's truck climbed the switchback road and disappeared into the darkness above the canyon. The clock ticked over to 11:48. I told myself it was just superstition. Old-timers at isolated facilities always had their rituals, their private jokes, their ways of making the job feel more important than it was. I'd seen it before. The graveyard shift guys at the treatment plant who insisted you never flush the West Bank toilets after 2 a.m. The pump station operators who wouldn't go into the South Vault on Fridays. It was all just stories, ways to pass the time, ways to make boring jobs feel less boring. I made coffee. I reviewed the equipment manuals. I sat at the console and watched the readouts. Flow rate steady, turbine output nominal, reservoir level normal. Outside the window, the darkness was absolute. No moon, no lights except the blinking red warnings on the towers. The sound of the outflow was constant, a white noise roar that somehow made the silence inside the control room feel heavier. At 12:15 a.m., I made my first mistake. I decided to test Rule 3, I want to be clear about my reasoning. I wasn't being reckless or stupid, I was being rational. That's what I told myself as I pulled on my jacket and stepped out onto the upper platform, flashlight in hand. The cold hit me immediately. Not just the temperature, which had dropped into the 30s, but a particular quality of cold that came off the water, damp and penetrating. The wind knifed across the reservoir surface and funneled between the canyon walls, making the metal railing sing with a low, keening note. The platform extended about 15 feet from the control building, providing a view across the reservoir's southern expanse. During the day, I imagined you could see for miles the drowned valley, the surrounding peaks, maybe even the skeletal remains of dead trees poking through the water near the old shoreline. Now at night there was nothing. The reservoir was a perfect lightless void, a hole in the world that seemed to pull at my vision. Rule 3. Do not shine any lights into the reservoir after midnight. I had several justifications ready. I needed to familiarize myself with the surroundings. I needed to understand the full scope of the facility. I needed to see if there were any obvious hazards or structural concerns visible from this vantage point. All reasonable, all defensible. The truth was simpler. I didn't believe the rule meant anything, and I needed to prove it to myself so I could dismiss the others. I raised the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam lanced out across the platform railing, over the 10-foot gap between the edge and the water, and touched the reservoir surface. What happened next I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times. I've tried to convince myself I misunderstood what I was seeing, that the angle was wrong, that my eyes were tired. None of those explanations holds up. The light didn't reflect off the water. It should have. The surface should have caught the beam and thrown it back, creating a bright spot, ripples of illumination, the normal behavior of light on liquid. Instead, the beam seemed to sink into the water, as if the surface wasn't a surface at all, but an opening, a threshold. The blackness didn't just fail to reflect, it absorbed, swallowed, drank the light down into depths I couldn't fathom. I adjusted my angle, sweeping the beam slowly across the water. Same result. The flashlight was working. When I turned it toward the canyon wall, the rock lit up normally. When I pointed it at the water, the light simply stopped. Then I saw the shapes. They were far below the surface, deeper than the beam should have been able to penetrate. Pale structures, angular and geometric, straight lines and right angles that had no business being in a natural lake. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, they were clear enough to identify. The peaked roof of a building, the orderly grid of streets, the sharp vertical line of what might have been a church steeple, a town, drowned, still down there. I knew the history. Marlowe had mentioned it in passing during the tour. Eagle Crest Reservoir was created in 1967 by flooding a valley that contained a small town, maybe 200 residents. The people had been relocated, the buildings supposedly demolished or left to the water. I was looking at the remnants preserved in the cold and the depth, a ghost town in the most literal sense. But that wasn't what made my hand start to shake. What made my hand shake was that some of the windows in those drowned buildings looked lit. Not brightly, not like electric lights, more like the faint silvery glow of moonlight through glass, except there was no moon. The illumination seemed to come from inside the structures, as if something down there was still active, still occupied, still maintaining a routine in the airless dark. The flashlight flickered. Once, twice. Then a sustained strobe that made the shapes below seem to move, to shift position in the gaps between pulses of light. Then the flashlight died completely. I was standing in total darkness, my thumb still pressing the dead switch, my breath coming fast and shallow. The wind had stopped. The reservoir surface, which I could no longer see but could still sense just beyond the railing, had gone utterly silent. No lapping of water, no gentle movement against the concrete, just stillness. And then rising from that stillness, I heard voices. They were muffled, distant, like sounds filtering through heavy fabric or thick walls. I couldn't make out words. Only rhythm and urgency, multiple voices overlapping, some louder, some softer, all of them carrying a tone that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was the sound of people calling out, people trying to be heard, people who needed something desperately and weren't getting it. The voices rose and fell like a wave, swelling towards something that might have been a crescendo, and then silence. Complete. Absolute. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the control building door. I fumbled for the handle, got it open, fell inside, and slammed it shut behind me. The control room's lights were blinding after the darkness outside. The equipment hummed normally. The clock read 12:19 a.m. I'd been out there less than 5 minutes. I sat at the console, my hands shaking, and tried to reconstruct a rational explanation. Sound could do strange things in canyons, echoes, reverberations, acoustic tricks. Wind through rock formations could sound like voices. The flashlight had probably just been low on batteries, and the flickering had created an optical illusion with the underwater structures, making them seem to move. I almost believed it. I picked up the clipboard and read Rule 3 again. Do not shine any lights into the reservoir after midnight. The phrasing was specific, not avoid using lights near the water or minimize light pollution. The rule said into the reservoir, as if the water itself was the concern, as if something about directing light beneath the surface triggered a response. I checked the flashlight. I replaced the batteries from a drawer in the console. The new batteries worked fine. The beam was strong and steady when I tested it against the wall. I did not test it on the water again. The rest of the shift passed slowly. I performed my 1 a.m. equipment check, logging the readings with hands that had mostly stopped shaking. I walked the interior corridor, my footsteps echoing off concrete. The caged bulbs casting shadows that seemed too dark for the amount of light they provided. I returned to the control room and drank coffee and watched the monitors and tried not to look at the window, where the downstream outflow churned white against invisible rock. At 5:47 a.m., the sky above the canyon rim began to gray. The stars faded. The world reasserted its dimensions and its rules. Marlowe arrived at 6:03. He looked at me carefully, then glanced at the logbook. Then at the clipboard still sitting on the console where I'd left it. Quiet night? He asked. Mostly. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than was comfortable. You look tired. First night. Getting used to the sounds. He nodded slowly. Sounds. Right. He poured himself coffee from the pot I'd made, took a sip, and stared out the window at the growing dawn. The rules seem strange at first. Most people think they're a joke, or they think they'll find the trick, the rational explanation. You get there eventually. Get where? To the point where you stop asking why, Marlowe said quietly, and you just follow them, because the alternative is worse. He didn't elaborate. He just finished his coffee, told me to get some sleep, and took his position at the console as I headed to my quarters. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the hum of the dam through the walls, feeling the faint vibration that never quite stopped. I thought about pale buildings in the deep. I thought about lights in drowned windows. I thought about voices rising from still water. I didn't think I'd sleep. I was wrong. When I woke, it was late afternoon, and my dreams had been full of churches with no doors, streets that ran vertically, and faces pressed against glass from the inside, watching for something that never came. The second night began the way the first had ended, with me sitting at the console, coffee in hand, trying to convince myself that routine and procedure were armor enough against whatever Eagle Crest held in its concrete bones. I'd spent the afternoon researching. My phone had no signal, but the control building had a desktop computer with satellite internet. slow and intermittent but functional. I'd looked up the history of the dam, the flooded town, and the construction timeline. The details were sparse. A valley development project in the mid-60s, federal funding. Residents relocated to a new township 40 miles east. Reservoir filled over the course of 18 months starting in January 1967. There was a small historical society website that mentioned the town's name, Stillwater. The population was 187 in the final census. The site included a few grainy photographs, a main street with a general store and a post office, a white church with a tall steeple, houses scattered along the valley floor, and the river running through it all. One photo showed the last residents standing in front of the church steps, holding signs protesting the relocation. The image quality was poor, faces indistinct, but the body language was clear: defeat, resignation, anger. The site mentioned that a few residents had refused to leave until the water was already rising, requiring a final evacuation by boat. It didn't say what happened to those who'd waited until the end, only that all residents were safely relocated. I wasn't sure I believed that qualifier anymore. At 11:52 p.m., I heard a vehicle on the access road. I looked up from the console, surprised. Marlowe hadn't mentioned anyone else coming to the site. Through the window, I watched a white utilities truck descend the switchbacks and park next to my car. A man got out, mid-30s athletic build, wearing a company jacket and carrying a heavy equipment case. He knocked once and let himself in before I could reach the door. "Night shift?" he asked, looking around the control room with an expression somewhere between amusement and disdain. "That's right. Caleb Navarro. Dane Pritchard, Regional Diagnostics." He set the equipment case down with a thud. "I'm here to run system checks on the new monitoring gear they installed last month. Should have been done during the day, but nobody told me this place was staffed 24/7 until I was already halfway here." "How long will it take?" "A few hours, maybe. I'll try to stay out of your way." He unzipped the case and pulled out a tablet and several cable connectors. "Jesus, it's cold in here. You guys don't have heat?" "It's on. The building's built into the dam. The cold comes through the concrete." Dane shook his head, already moving toward the diagnostic panel on the east wall. "Mountain assignments, I swear. They save these for people they're trying to push out." I returned to the console, logging the midnight readings. Dane worked in silence for a while, muttering occasionally at his tablet, disconnecting and reconnecting cables. At 12:30, he paused and looked at the laminated rule sheet I'd left on the counter. "What's this? Do not shine any lights into the reservoir after midnight." He read a few more entries, then laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Oh man, you guys really lean into the creepy isolated facility thing, don't you?" "It's a safety protocol," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "It's bullshit is what it is." He set the clipboard down. "I've worked at 20 facilities in 4 states. Half of them are in the middle of nowhere. You know what they all have in common? Superstitious old-timers who've been doing the job so long they forget how to separate routine from ghost stories." I didn't respond. I'd learned in my previous job that arguing with consultants was a waste of energy. Dane kept reading. "Avoid crossing the exterior catwalk between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. Why? What happens at 2:15? Does the ghost union take its smoke break?" He grinned at his own joke. "If you see faces in the downstream observation window, step away." Faces. In water. Incredible. He looked at me, clearly expecting me to laugh or agree. When I didn't, his grin faded slightly. "You don't actually follow this stuff, do you?" I chose my words carefully. "I've been here 2 nights. I don't have enough information to know what's useful and what's not. So I'm erring on the side of caution." "That's the problem with this industry," Dane said, turning back to his equipment. "Nobody questions anything. Someone writes a weird rule 50 years ago and it just stays there forever because everyone's too scared to look stupid by asking why. At 1:40 a.m., a soft chime came from the console, a minor alert, yellow rather than red. I checked the readout. Flow irregularity detected, spillway outflow. Visual inspection recommended. I pulled up the diagnostic screen. The numbers showed a slight variance in downstream flow rate. Nothing critical, but enough to warrant a physical check of the spillway mechanism. Standard procedure would be to go to the downstream observation room and verify that nothing was obstructing the outflow. Dane looked over my shoulder. That's an easy fix. Let's go check it. It's not critical, I said. I can wait until the alarm clears on its own or check it after 2:30. After 2:30? Why? I pointed to Rule 7 on the clipboard. Dane stared at it, then at me, incredulous. You're seriously telling me you're going to let an active alert sit there because of a superstition about a specific 10-minute window? It's not critical, I repeated. It's also not going to resolve itself. Come on, man. We walk down there, we look at the spillway, we confirm it's fine, and we come back. 5 minutes, max. I've got to finish these diagnostics, and I'm not spending the rest of the night here because you're afraid of a catwalk. I wanted to refuse. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained in facility operations, that understood protocols and equipment management, pointed out that Dane was technically right. The alert was active. Visual confirmation was recommended. And the rule didn't forbid crossing the catwalk. It just said to avoid it during a specific window. If we went now, we'd be done before 2:10. Fine, I said. But we do it quickly and we're back before 2. We left the control room and took the corridor to the downstream observation station. The interior of the dam was always cold, but this passage felt worse, a deep chill that seeped through my jacket and settled into my bones. The caged bulbs overhead seemed dimmer than they should have been, casting long shadows between pools of yellow light. The observation room was a narrow chamber built into the dam's downstream face, barely large enough for 2 people. One wall was dominated by a thick glass window, maybe 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, that looked out over the base of the spillway. Below us, hundreds of feet down, the outflow crashed against rock in a constant thunder of white water. Dane pressed his face near the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the reflection from the room's single overhead light. Looks normal to me. Water's flowing, gates are clear. Probably just a sensor glitch. I stayed back from the window, close to the door. The room's vibration was different from the rest of the dam. More erratic, less like a machine's hum and more like a pulse, something organic. Then Dane went still. What the hell? What? There's something in the water. Shapes. Look. Every instinct told me not to. Rule 9 was explicit. If you see faces in the downstream observation window, step away. But Dane was already tapping the glass, pointing. Right there. See them? In the foam. I stepped closer despite myself, just close enough to see past the reflection. The spillway outflow was chaotic. Water exploding against rock, spray and turbulence creating patterns that formed and dissolved in fractions of a second. But in that chaos there were consistencies. Pale ovals that appeared in the foam lingered too long to be random and repeated. Not identical, but similar. The proportions were wrong for bubbles or ice. They were too regular, too symmetrical. They looked like faces, not clear, not photographic, but suggestive enough that once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. Dozens of them pressed against the water's surface from below, mouths open in expressions that could have been surprise or horror or desperate communication. They appeared in clusters, faded, and reappeared slightly closer to the glass. Bubbles, Dane said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Light refraction, something with the minerals in the water catching the... One of the shapes pressed closer. For just a moment, less than a second, the features resolved with sickening clarity. Hollow eyes, mouth stretched too wide, skin the color of drowned flesh. Then it was gone, dissolved back into foam. "Jesus Christ," Dane whispered. The vibration in the room changed. The roar of the outflow dropped in pitch, becoming deeper, slower, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. The glass in front of us gave a sharp crack, loud as a gunshot in the small space. Hairline fractures appeared in the upper right corner of the window, spreading in a starburst pattern. I watched them lengthen, branch, reach toward the center of the pane. Then they stopped. And then, impossibly, they reversed, the cracks shrinking, pulling back into themselves, vanishing as if they'd never existed. The glass was whole again, flawless. All the faces in the water disappeared at once. The outflow returned to chaotic white noise, normal and explicable. "We're leaving," I said. I grabbed Dane's arm and pulled him toward the door. He didn't resist. His face had gone pale and his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. We walked quickly back down the corridor, not quite running but close. Neither of us spoke until we were back in the control room, the door sealed behind us. Dane stood in the center of the room, hands shaking, staring at nothing. He tried twice to speak before words came out. That wasn't... "Sit down," I said, guiding him to a chair. "When do you need to leave?" The diagnostics aren't finished. I need at least another hour." "Then finish them. Don't go near the windows, don't go outside, and don't touch anything that isn't directly part of your equipment check." He nodded numbly. I checked the clock. 2:03 a.m. We'd made it back with 7 minutes to spare. Dane worked in silence for the next hour, his earlier bravado completely gone. Every few minutes he'd glance at the downstream window, then quickly look away. At 3:15 he packed his equipment with trembling hands. "I'm putting in my report that the monitoring systems are functioning normally," he said quietly. "I'm going to recommend they schedule future diagnostics during day shifts. I'm going to suggest that they review the structural integrity of the observation room window." "Good idea." He paused at the door, one hand on the handle. "Those rules, the ones I said were bullshit." "Yeah? They're not, are they?" "No." He left without another word. I watched his taillights climb the switchback road and disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. I picked up the clipboard and read through the rules again, slowly, understanding now that each one represented someone's bad experience, someone's close call, someone's lesson learned the hard way. Rule 9. If you see faces in the downstream observation window, step away. Do not tap the glass. Dane had tapped the glass. The window had cracked. And something with enough force or will or presence to fracture reinforced industrial glass had briefly answered before pulling back, retreating, waiting for another chance. I spent the rest of the shift hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every fluctuation in the equipment readouts. When Marlowe arrived at dawn, he took one look at me and said, "Rough night?" A contractor came by, Regional Diagnostics. He tested one of the rules. Marlowe's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew colder. "Which one?" "Rule 9, the observation window." "Is he coming back?" "He said he'd recommend day shift scheduling for future visits." "Smart man." Marlowe poured coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. "Most people only need one demonstration. The ones who need more than one don't tend to last." "What happened to the last night operator?" "The one before me?" Marlowe was silent for a long moment, staring out at the reservoir as the rising sun turned the water from black to gray to a dull, metallic blue. "He followed the rules for 3 months," he finally said. "Then one night he decided he knew better. decided he'd figured out the pattern, the trick, decided the rules were just psychological conditioning. He set his coffee down. They found his car in the parking area. His jacket was on the upper platform railing. His flashlight was on the catwalk over the spillway. He was never found. When was this? 6 weeks ago. The timeline fits. 6 weeks since the posting had gone up. 6 weeks since Eagle Crest had needed a new night operator. I looked at the clipboard, at the rules written in different hands over different years, and understood. I was reading a survival manual written in other people's mistakes. "Get some sleep," Marlowe said. "You're back on tonight." I went to my quarters, but sleep was a long time coming. When it finally arrived, my dreams were full of cracking glass and faces beneath foam and the sound of something vast shifting in the deep. By my fourth night, I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening at Eagle Crest. Rationalization required a framework where cause and effect followed predictable patterns, where phenomena had explanations rooted in physics and engineering. That framework didn't apply here. Whatever governed the dam's behavior operated by different rules, older rules, ones that humans hadn't written. But I'm a methodical person, and if I couldn't explain what was happening, I could at least try to understand it better, to map its contours, to find patterns in the chaos. Knowledge might not be protection, but ignorance was definitely dangerous. During my afternoon hours, while the sun was high and the dam felt marginally less oppressive, I began systematically searching the control building. The filing cabinets in the back corner of the control room were old, gray metal, dented, the kind that had probably been here since the dam's construction. The first 2 drawers contained exactly what you'd expect: maintenance logs, equipment manuals, safety protocols, all carefully organized and dated. The third drawer was the same. The fourth drawer stuck when I tried to open it. I pulled harder, and it gave way with a screech of metal on metal. Inside, pushed to the very back behind a row of faded binders, was an unmarked folder. Manila, swollen with age and moisture, held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when I touched it. I brought the folder to the desk and opened it carefully. The contents were a mess, as if multiple people had contributed over many years without any attempt at organization. Photocopied newspaper clippings, handwritten notes on water-stained paper, incident reports on official letterhead, yellowed photographs and printouts from websites that no longer existed. I spread the documents out and began sorting them chronologically. The oldest was a newspaper clipping from the Stillwater Valley Register, dated March 1967. Last families evacuated as reservoir rises. The final 12 families remaining in the former town of Stillwater were evacuated by federal authorities yesterday as water from the newly completed Eagle Crest Dam reached the valley floor. The holdout families who had resisted the relocation order for 3 months were transported by boat to temporary housing. One resident, Martha Hensley, 67, reportedly refused to board the evacuation boat and had to be physically removed from her home as water entered the first floor. "This is our town," she told authorities. "You can move our bodies, but you can't move what we built. It stays here. It stays." Federal officials confirmed all residents were safely relocated and accounted for. The reservoir is expected to reach its operational depth of 340 feet within 6 weeks. Clipped to that article was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. Official count, 187 residents relocated. Unofficial count, 192 residents last census before the flood. 5 are unaccounted for in the final evacuation report. Discrepancy explained as census error. Martha Hensley was one of the 5. The next several documents detailed the dam's early operational years. Routine enough on the surface, but with odd gaps and marginal notes. An incident report from July 1968 described a turbine malfunction that resulted in unusual vibrations and acoustic anomalies during night shifts. The resolution, according to the official report, was mechanical adjustment. But someone, the handwriting was different, shakier, had written in the margin, not mechanical. Voices in the turbine housing. Words I couldn't make out but recognized the rhythm. Valley accent. Sarah's accent. Sarah drowned in the old town square when she fell during evacuation. This is her. Another report dated October 1971 described a construction worker who fell from the upper catwalk during late-night maintenance. The official cause was equipment failure, safety harness defect. The margin note read, "He told me he saw people walking on the reservoir surface, people in old-fashioned clothes carrying suitcases. He leaned over the railing to look closer. The harness didn't fail. He jumped." I found a photocopy of a page from what looked like a personal journal, undated, but the paper quality suggested early 1980s. This is my 147th night shift at Eagle Crest. I've learned not to argue with it. The dam isn't haunted. It's not that simple. It's more like it's remembering. The concrete holds pressure, yes, but it also holds something else. Memory. Intention. The weight of what was displaced. You flood a valley, you bury a town, you silence 192 people's worth of daily routines and weekly rituals and lifelong connections. All that energy doesn't just disappear. It gets stored, compressed, held in place by 600,000 cubic yards of concrete and 4.2 billion gallons of water. And at night, when there's no one around to insist on the official narrative, when the only witness is a single operator in a control room, that's when the pressure equalizes. That's when what's held in comes back out, looking for acknowledgement, looking for release, looking for someone to finally see them. The rules aren't about avoiding ghosts. They're about not giving them opportunities. Every rule is a gap we've learned not to leave open. Every rule is a lesson someone paid for. Beneath that was a list, handwritten in multiple inks and styles, clearly added to over many years. Do not look at the reservoir with artificial light. It shows you what's beneath instead of what's on top. Do not respond to voices from unmanned areas. If you acknowledge them, they know you can hear. Do not cross certain thresholds at certain times. There are moments when the pressure equalizes, when the membrane between here and there is thinnest. Do not tap the glass. It interprets contact as an invitation. Do not investigate inconsistencies in equipment readings. Sometimes the dam is lying, testing your compliance. Do not try to help or rescue anyone you see on the water or hear in the structure after dark. They are not asking for help you can give. I found photographs near the bottom of the folder. Old Polaroids and early digital prints, many of them blurred or poorly lit. One showed the downstream observation window with the camera flash reflecting off the glass. But behind the reflection, barely visible, there were shapes in the water that didn't look like foam. Another showed the upper platform at night, the reservoir beyond it, and something pale and vertical in the water about 50 yards out. Too straight to be natural. Too thin to be a tree trunk. The most disturbing photograph was nearly black, as if taken in almost total darkness. It showed the interior corridor, the perspective looking down the length of it toward the far end. The caged bulbs cast their small pools of light, creating alternating bands of illumination and shadow. In one of the dark spaces between lights, there was a figure. It was indistinct. The low light and poor camera quality made details impossible, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, standing in a posture that suggested something between standing and floating. The figure's face, if it had one, was turned toward the camera, written on the back of the photo in faded pen. Gallery B, 3:47 a.m., November 2003. Developed film. Figure not visible to the naked eye at time photo was taken. Haven't used the camera since. I sat back, my hands shaking slightly. The folder represented decades of accumulated evidence, not scientific evidence, not anything that would hold up to external scrutiny, but the detailed observations of people who'd worked here night after night and slowly documented the dam's behavior. This was the real manual, the one they couldn't put in an official document, the one that had to be hidden in the back of a filing cabinet where only the night operators would find it. Near the bottom of the pile, I found a single sheet of paper with a timeline. Timeline of Eagle Crest night shift incidents, 1967-1970. 3 operators rotate. Minor anomalies reported, dismissed as stress isolation. 1971, first serious incident. Operator Richards vanishes, assumed drowning, body never found. 1971-1985, rules begin to be documented. Operator turnover every 6 to 18 months. 1986, second fatality. Operator Chen found at the base of the dam. The cause of the fall is undetermined. 1985 to 2000, rules expand. Turnover stabilizes as operators learn to follow protocols. 2001 present, continued low-level anomalous activity, rules updated periodically. Current operator attrition rate 40% within the first month, 80% within 6 months. Those who last 6 months typically stay for years. Key finding: the dam doesn't stop. It doesn't get worse, but it doesn't improve. It has reached equilibrium. Follow the rules. Survival. Break the rules. So consequences. There is no fixing it. There is only management. I closed the folder and sat in the silent control room as the afternoon faded toward evening. The hum of the dam surrounded me, steady and patient and eternal. I understood now what Marlowe had meant. Eagle Crest wasn't a problem to be solved, it was a situation to be endured. The rules weren't superstition, they were accumulated wisdom. The collective knowledge of everyone who'd stood where I was standing and survived long enough to write down what they'd learned. The question wasn't whether the rules were real. The question was whether I could follow them perfectly every night, without exception, knowing that each rule represented someone else's mistake and that my own mistake would eventually become someone else's warning. That night, as I began my shift, I copied the additional rules from the hidden folder onto a separate sheet of paper and clipped it to the official laminated list. The clipboard was getting crowded with annotations, margin notes, and additions in different handwriting. It was a record of collective survival. I intended to add to it, not become a cautionary entry. At 1:17 a.m., I glanced at one of the monitors and saw my own reflection in the screen, my face overlaid on the flow rate diagram. Except the reflection showed the control room behind me, and in that reflection the window displayed the reservoir view that should have been blocked by the angle. And in the reservoir's reflection there were lights beneath the surface. Street lights arranged in a grid, as if a town was still down there, still functioning, still lit. I didn't turn around to check if the view matched. I changed which monitor I was looking at and didn't look back. Some things I was learning you survived by choosing not to verify. On the evening of my 6th night, I was reviewing equipment logs when I heard a vehicle descending the access road. I checked the time, 10:47 p.m. Too early for my shift to officially start, but late enough that no one should be arriving. Marlowe didn't do social visits, and we weren't expecting any maintenance crews after what had happened with Dane. I went to the window and watched Marlowe's truck park in its usual spot. He got out slowly, moving like a man who'd made a decision he didn't particularly like but saw as necessary. He was carrying a metal thermos and a paper bag, the universal signals of a longer conversation than usual. He knocked once and entered, his eyes sweeping the control room before settling on me. "Navarro, you look tired." "I am tired. You're still here, though. That's something." He set the thermos and bag on the counter. "Coffee. Real stuff, not the instant garbage in that cabinet. And sandwiches. You eat dinner?" "Not yet. Eat." We sat at the small table in the corner away from the console. Marlowe poured coffee into the thermos cap and slid it toward me. The gesture felt ritualistic, like the beginning of something significant. Outside, the last light was draining from the canyon, the reservoir turning from gray to black. I waited for him to speak. I'd learned that Marlowe didn't waste words, and pushing him would only make him retreat. He drank his coffee slowly, staring at the wall. Finally, "I saw you found the folder." I wasn't surprised he knew. "The one in the filing cabinet." "Yes. Figured you would. Smart people always do. Dumb people last about 3 nights and leave. Smart people start digging, trying to understand." He glanced at me. "The question is what you do with what you found." I added some of the notes to my rule sheet. Figured they were there for a reason. "They are." He paused. "I've been working at Eagle Crest for 32 years. Started as a day maintenance tech in 1991, moved to operations, and finally took over as site supervisor. I've seen 11 night operators come and go in that time. You want to know how many made it past the first month?" "How many?" 4. You're number 5 if you finish this week." The coffee was good, rich and strong, the kind that cleared your head instead of just providing caffeine. I ate one of the sandwiches, suddenly ravenous. Marlowe watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You want to know why I came back tonight?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Because you lasted through the first test, the light on the water, and you didn't quit. You lasted through the second test, the observation window incident, and you didn't blame me or the facility or try to convince yourself it was explainable. That means you're taking this seriously. And people who take it seriously deserve to understand what they're dealing with." He refilled his coffee cup. Eagle Crest was built between 1964 and 1967. Federal project, Army Corps of Engineers, all the usual bureaucracy. The valley, Stillwater Valley, was privately owned land, with a couple of hundred residents, mostly farming and forestry families. The government used eminent domain, offered relocation packages. Most people took them, some didn't. I read about the holdouts, the final evacuations. You read the official version. Here's what actually happened. Marlowe's voice dropped lower. By the time they started filling the reservoir in January '67, there were still 12 families refusing to leave. Federal marshals came in, forcibly removed people from their homes. Most went peacefully in the end. What choice did they have? But 5 people weren't accounted for in the final evacuation manifest. I saw that discrepancy mentioned in the notes. Official explanation was census error. The real explanation is that those 5 people chose to stay, chose to go down with the town rather than leave. One of them was Martha Hensley. That part made the papers because she fought the marshals. The other 4 were quieter about it. They just disappeared into their houses, locked the doors, and waited for the water. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They drowned themselves. They drowned, yes. Whether it was suicide or murder or something else depends on how you look at it. They saw the flooding as an execution and they refused to walk away from what they'd built. So they stayed. Marlowe's eyes were distant. The water rose over 3 weeks, slow enough that anyone could have escaped. They chose not to. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the dam's downstream face. Construction was finished in April '67. The reservoir reached full depth by June. First anomalies started being reported in August. Equipment malfunctions, acoustic oddities, operators reporting feeling watched. By October, the first night operator quit. Said he'd heard voices on the intercom from areas that were supposed to be empty. Said he'd seen lights in the reservoir that moved in patterns like vehicles driving on submerged streets. Did they investigate? Of course they investigated. Sent divers down, used sonar, checked every system, found nothing wrong mechanically. Found the town ruins, sure, they'd only demolished some of the buildings before flooding left the rest to deteriorate. But there was no explanation for the reports. So they did what institutions do. They wrote it off as isolation-induced hallucinations, operator stress, equipment echoes. Except it kept happening. It kept happening. Different operators, same reports year after year, voices, lights, shapes in the water, figures in the corridors, and every so often someone would die, fall off the catwalk, drown in the reservoir under mysterious circumstances, vanish entirely. Marlowe turned back to face me. By the mid-70s, the night operators had started writing down patterns. Which locations were dangerous? Which times were worse than others? What behaviors seemed to trigger responses? That's when the rules started. The dam never stopped operating? Why would it? It generates enough power for 40,000 homes. It controls flooding for the entire downstream basin. A few dead operators and some unexplained incidents? That's acceptable losses as far as the bureaucracy is concerned. So they kept staffing it, kept running it, and the night operators kept documenting what they learned. He sat back down, his face looking older in the harsh fluorescent light. Here's what I think is happening, based on 3 decades of watching this place. When you flood a valley, you're not just burying land, you're erasing human presence, homes, routines, memories, the accumulated psychic weight of people living their lives in a specific place. Most of the time, that weight dissipates. The people move on, literally and figuratively. But in cases like Stillwater, where people died in place, where they actively chose to stay as the water rose. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think their refusal to leave created a kind of anchor. I think whatever makes a place feel inhabited, the echo of daily life, the residual pattern of human intention, got trapped here when the water closed over the valley. And I think the dam, with all its concrete and pressure and controlled force, acts like a... He struggled for the metaphor. Like a capacitor. It holds the charge, it contains the pressure, and at night, when the operational activity drops, when there's less human presence to override it, that pressure equalizes. What's held down comes back up. You're saying the dam is haunted by an entire town. I'm saying the dam is containing something that wants to be acknowledged, wants to be remembered. The people who stayed behind, who drowned rather than leave, they made a statement. And that statement is still being made every night in 100 small ways. I thought about the faces in the spillway foam, the lights in the reservoir, the voices on the intercom. Why do the rules work? Because they're boundaries. They're acknowledgments without engagement. By following the rules, you're essentially saying, I recognize you're here, but I'm not interacting with you. You're maintaining the separation between their space and yours. But when you break a rule, when you shine a light into the water, when you answer the intercom, when you tap the glass, you're initiating contact. You're opening a gap in the boundary, and they respond. How do you know this? How can you be sure? Marlowe's expression darkened. Because I broke a rule once, 23 years ago. I was a night operator then, not a supervisor. I was young and stubborn, and I thought I'd figured out a pattern. Thought I could predict when things were safe and when they weren't. He rolled up his left sleeve. His forearm was marked with scars. Not surgical scars, but something more chaotic, like deep gouges that had healed badly. There's a rule about the lower gallery that used to be less specific. It just said avoid the lower gallery between 2 and 4 a.m. I decided that was bullshit. I decided I'd go down there during that window and prove it was safe. So at 2:30, I unlocked the stairwell and went down. What happened? I made it halfway down the stairs before I heard the water. Not turbine water, this was different, sloshing, rising, coming up the stairs toward me. I turned to run back up, and something grabbed my arm. Fingers ice cold, strong as steel cable. I couldn't see what it was. The lights in that stairwell had all gone out, but I felt it pulling me back down toward the water I could hear rising below. He pulled his sleeve back down. I broke free eventually, tore most of the skin off my forearm in the process. When I got back to the control room and turned the lights on, there was no water in the stairwell. I checked the logs. No flooding, no leaks, nothing. But my arm was torn up like I'd dragged it across broken glass, and I had bruises around my wrist in the clear pattern of fingers. 4 fingers and a thumb. Human proportions. The control room felt very small suddenly, the walls very close. That's when I became a believer, Marlowe said quietly. That's when I stopped trying to understand why and started focusing on surviving. And I've survived by following the rules, every single one. No exceptions, no tests, no clever ideas about loopholes or timing. The rules are what they are because every single one was bought with someone's bad experience. He looked at me directly. You've been doing well. You followed Rule 3 after you tested it once. You got Dane out of the observation room before something worse happened. You found the folder and took it seriously instead of dismissing it. But I need you to understand something. The dam is patient. It doesn't need to kill you quickly. It can wait for you to get comfortable, to think you figured out the rhythm, to believe you're safe because you've survived a week or a month. And the moment you relax, the moment you think just this once about any rule, that's when it has you. Is there any way to end it? To release them or cleanse the place or... No. His answer was flat, absolute. This isn't a movie where you solve the mystery and the ghosts find peace. This is a dam holding back pressure, and that's all it will ever be. You can manage it, but you can't fix it. The only choice is whether you follow the rules and survive, or you break them and join the count. He stood, collecting the thermos and the remains of our meal. I didn't come back tonight to scare you. I came back to make sure you understood what you're dealing with. Because you're doing better than most, and I'd rather not fill your position again in 3 weeks. Why do you stay? I asked. 32 years. Why not transfer, retire, leave? Marlowe smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Someone has to know. Someone has to maintain the institutional knowledge, make sure the rules get passed down, and watch for operators who might actually make it. I'm too old to start over somewhere else. And honestly, he paused at the door. I made a bargain with this place 23 years ago when it let me go. I survived, so I owe it the respect of bearing witness. That's my rule, the one I made for myself. He left at 11:52, refusing to stay past midnight as always. I sat alone in the control room as the hour rolled over, the clipboard of rules in front of me, understanding fully now that I wasn't just an operator maintaining equipment. I was a boundary keeper, and the boundary was tested every single night. The knowledge Marlowe had shared should have made things easier. Understanding the nature of what I was dealing with, that the anomalies were consistent, that the rules were reliable, that survival was simply a matter of compliance, should have reduced my anxiety. Instead, it made everything worse. Because now I knew the dam wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was intelligent enough to learn, patient enough to wait, and purposeful enough to test. Every night I worked became a chess game against an opponent that had been playing for 56 years and had infinite patience. My 8th night started normally. Equipment checks at midnight and 1 a.m. showed normal operations. Flow rates steady, reservoir level consistent with seasonal projections, turbine output nominal. I walked the interior corridor at 12:30, my footsteps echoing off concrete, the caged bulbs casting their familiar pools of light. Everything was exactly as it should be. At 1:37 a.m., the console speaker crackled. The intercom system at Eagle Crest was old. Installed decades ago, probably never upgraded because it worked well enough for basic communication between the control room and the various stations throughout the dam. Under normal operations, it sat silent unless I manually activated it to perform equipment tests. The crackle resolved into static, then a voice. "Hello? Control? This is maintenance in the lower gallery. We've got a situation down here. We need you to open the access door." My blood went cold. Rule 5. If you hear someone speaking on the intercom from the lower gallery after 1:30 a.m., do not respond. No one is scheduled down there at night. I checked the intercom panel. The indicator light showed the transmission was coming from Station 7, the lower gallery checkpoint, 3 levels below the control room, located in the oldest part of the dam's internal structure. A place that should be completely empty at night. The voice continued. "Control, do you copy? We've got a leak down here. Water's coming through the east wall seal. We need the door unlocked so we can get to the emergency shutoff." The voice sounded professionally calm, using proper terminology, following correct radio protocol. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't studied the rules, I would have responded immediately. I forced myself to stay silent. My hand hovered over the intercom button, then pulled back. I looked at the clipboard. Do not respond. The static hissed for 10 seconds. 20. Then the voice came back, and this time there was an edge to it. Urgency, maybe frustration. "Control, this is serious. The leak is getting worse. We need access to the shutoff valve, or we're going to have a structural compromise. Acknowledge this transmission." I bit my lip. My training, my entire professional background screamed at me to respond. Someone reporting a leak in a dam was a critical safety issue. Ignoring it violated every protocol I'd ever learned. But the rule was explicit. The intercom fell silent again. I waited, counting seconds, watching the indicator light that showed Station 7 was still transmitting, even though no sound was coming through. When the voice returned, it had changed completely. "Caleb, it's Dane. I came back to double-check some readings and I got lost down here. I took a wrong turn at the junction and now I can't find my way back. The doors are locked and I think I heard water moving behind the walls. I need you to unlock the access door. Please, man. I don't want to be down here anymore." My hands clenched into fists. The voice was perfect. Dane's exact cadence, his particular mix of confidence and irritation, even the slight nasal quality of his speech. If I hadn't seen Dane leave 5 nights ago, if I didn't know the lower gallery was supposed to be empty, I would have believed completely that he'd somehow returned and gotten trapped. "Come on, Caleb. You know me. We went to the observation room together, remember? You helped me when I was freaked out. Now I need your help. Just unlock the door. Just talk to me so I know someone's listening." I reached for the door control panel, the physical override that would unlock the lower gallery access. My finger was an inch from the button when the voice said something that stopped me. "It's okay, Kalito. You don't want to let me drown, do you?" Kalito, a nickname my mother had used for me when I was 6 years old, a private family word I hadn't heard in 24 years since she'd died. Something I'd never told anyone, something that existed only in my own memory. The dam had been listening, not just to my conversations, but deeper. To my thoughts, my memories, my private history. It had been inside my head, learning what words would make me respond, what emotional triggers would overcome my caution. I pulled my hand back from the control panel like it was burning. The intercom went silent for a full minute. When the voice returned, it had dropped all pretense of humanity. It was flat, affectless, mechanical. "Open the door." I reached over and manually shut off the intercom system, physically pulling the connection. The light went dark. In the sudden silence, I heard something else, knocking. It came from below, from somewhere deep in the structure, echoing up through the concrete, rhythmic, insistent, fists on metal. Fists on a door that was locked, that I had the power to unlock, that something on the other side desperately wanted opened. The knocking continued for 12 minutes. I timed it, watching the clock, forcing myself to sit still and not investigate, not respond, not acknowledge what I was hearing. The sound grew gradually weaker, the impacts spreading farther apart until finally, at 2:03 a.m., it stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I sat at the console, my heart hammering, understanding that I'd just passed a test. The dam had tried persuasion, professional obligation, emotional manipulation, and finally direct command. It had used my memories against me, had proven it could access things I'd thought were private and safe, and I had refused it anyway. But the refusal didn't feel like a victory. It felt like escalation. At 2:17 a.m., I got up to walk the interior corridor, part of my routine, a way to verify that what I'd heard hadn't caused any actual damage. I unlocked the corridor access and stepped into the familiar tunnel of concrete and caged lights. Everything looked normal for the first 50 feet. Then I noticed that one of the lights ahead was out. Not unusual, bulbs failed regularly. But as I walked closer, I saw that it wasn't just out. The cage around it had been bent outward from the inside, the metal twisted and deformed, the bulb shattered. Small fragments of glass glittered on the concrete floor. I stopped walking. The next light up the corridor flickered once, twice, then exploded in its cage with a sharp pop that echoed like a gunshot. Darkness rushed toward me. I turned and ran back to the control room, not caring how it looked, not caring about procedure. I slammed the corridor door and locked it, breathing hard. Through the small window in the door, I watched the corridor lights go out one by one, starting from the far end and progressing toward me. Pop, pop, pop. Each small explosion of glass and darkness brings the shadows closer. The progression stopped one light away from the control room door. The last bulb on the corridor side flickered wildly but stayed lit, casting erratic shadows that made the hallway beyond seem to shift and move. Then in that unstable light, I saw something. A figure tall and thin was standing at the far end of the corridor where the lights had all gone dark. I couldn't make out details. The distance and darkness prevented that. But I could see its general shape, its wrong proportions, the way it stood perfectly still in a posture that was almost but not quite human. It didn't approach. It just stood there, barely visible at the edge of the light, waiting. I checked the corridor access log. According to the electronic record, the door was still locked. No one had entered. No one was supposed to be there. I forced myself to turn away from the window, to sit back at the console, to focus on the equipment readings. All normal. The dam hummed around me, steady and patient. At 2:31 a.m., I heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to hear through the locked door. Walking toward the control room, each footfall echoes precisely in the concrete space. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I didn't look at the window. Rule 6. From the additional notes I'd found, if you hear footsteps approaching the control room door between 2 and 4 a.m., do not look at the door until they've been gone for 5 minutes. Eye contact is permission. I stared at the console, at the screens, at anything except the door behind me. I felt the presence there, felt the weight of attention focused on the back of my head. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to verify what was standing 3 feet away with only a door between us. I didn't turn. The presence stayed for 7 minutes. I watched the clock, counting seconds. Then finally I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, walking away down the corridor. The sound faded. The lights in the hallway, which I could see reflected faintly in the console screens, began flickering back on one by one. At 3 a.m., the corridor was fully lit again. I checked the door window. Empty. No figure. No signs of anything wrong except the 2 shattered light fixtures. I added a note to my personal rule sheet. 2:30 a.m. seems to be the peak activity window. Consider this period maximum risk for any activity outside the control room. The rest of the shift passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the dam was done being subtle. It had shown me what it could access, my memories, my emotions, my physical space. It had demonstrated that the boundaries were permeable when it wanted them to be, that the rules weren't barriers but truces, agreements that held only as long as both sides honored them. I had survived by not giving it the opening it wanted, by not unlocking the door, by not looking at what stood outside the control room. But survival felt different now. Before, it had felt like I was evading something. Now it felt like I was resisting something, and resistance was inherently unstable. When Marlowe arrived at dawn, he saw the shattered lights immediately. What happened? I told him everything, the intercom, the voice using Dane's identity, and then my mother's nickname, the knocking, the lights exploding, the figure in the corridor, the footsteps outside the door. He listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively grimmer. When I finished, he walked to the corridor door, checked the lock, and examined the shattered light fixtures through the window. "It's testing you specifically now," he said quietly. "Not just running its standard patterns. It knows you're smart enough to follow the basic rules, so it's escalating. Trying to find your breaking point. Why? Why does it care? Because you're the boundary keeper. You're the human presence that maintains the separation. If it can break you, get you to respond, to investigate, to open something that should stay closed, then the boundary weakens. Then it has more room to operate." He turned to face me. "This is the critical phase. This is where most people break. Where the pressure becomes too much and they convince themselves that just once, just one small violation, won't matter. I'm not going to violate the rules. I believe you, but belief isn't the same as certainty. Get some sleep. You're back on tonight." I went to my quarters, but sleep was nearly impossible. Every sound in the building made me tense. Every creak of the structure, every vibration of the turbines made me wonder if the dam was moving through the walls, finding new ways to reach me. When I finally slept, I dreamed I was standing in the lower gallery watching water seep through the walls. The water was ice cold and full of silt, and in the silt were shapes. Hands, faces, objects from daily life rendered in sediment. A key, a wedding ring, a child's toy. And in the dream, I knew that if I unlocked the door, if I let the water out, these things would resolve into their proper forms. The hands would become whole people. The faces would gain bodies. Everything that had been compressed and trapped would expand and reform. All I had to do was turn the handle. I woke at 9:47 p.m., soaked with sweat, and spent the next 2 hours preparing myself for whatever the 10th night would bring. I began my 10th shift with a superstitious ritual I'd developed, checking every rule on the clipboard, reading each one carefully, committing them to memory once again. It was like armor, not physical protection, but psychological reinforcement. A reminder that other people had survived this, that the rules were tested and reliable, that compliance was the path through the darkness. The night started quietly, too quietly. The equipment hummed normally. The readouts were stable. The reservoir sat black and still beyond the windows. It felt like the pause before a storm, the moment when pressure builds and the air grows heavy and everything waits for the first lightning strike. At 2:03 a.m., the console alarm triggered. Red lights flashed across the panel. The warning was clear. Flow anomaly detected. Spillway discharge. Visual inspection required. Priority Alpha. Priority Alpha meant immediate response. It meant a potential structural or safety issue that could escalate rapidly if not addressed. In dam operations, you didn't ignore Priority Alpha warnings. I pulled up the diagnostic data. The readings were contradictory. The upstream flow sensors showed normal input from the reservoir, but the downstream sensors showed discharge output fluctuating wildly, swinging between 30% below normal and 40% above normal within 5-second intervals. The spillway gates, according to the mechanical sensors, were in their standard position, but the water volume passing through them was behaving impossibly. The system protocol was explicit. Visual inspection of the spillway mechanism was required to verify sensor accuracy and gate position. The only way to perform that inspection was to cross the exterior catwalk that spanned the spillway's face, the same catwalk forbidden by Rule 7. I checked the clock. 2:04 a.m. Rule 7. Avoid crossing the exterior catwalk over the spillway between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m., regardless of alarms. I had 6 minutes before the forbidden window began. 6 minutes to either perform the inspection or find an alternative. I pulled up the camera feeds. The dam had exterior cameras positioned at various points, including 2 that covered portions of the spillway. Both screens showed static, not system failure, just heavy interference rendering the images useless. I rebooted the camera system. Same result. The alarm continued blaring. The flow readings continued their impossible fluctuations. I ran through alternatives. Could I check the spillway from the downstream observation room? No. That only showed the outflow below the gates, not the gates themselves. Could I use the auxiliary monitoring station? No, it only duplicated the same sensors that were giving contradictory data. Could I wait until after 2:20? Maybe. But if there was a genuine mechanical failure, delaying 10 minutes could result in structural damage or flooding. The console began displaying a secondary message. Gate position discrepancy. Manual verification required. Personnel safety protocol. Exterior inspection mandatory. The system was pushing me toward the catwalk. Hard. At 2:08 a.m., I made a decision. I went to the manual control panel, the backup system that predated all the electronic monitors, the mechanical failsafe that could override everything. It consisted of large industrial switches and physical valve controls that directly manipulated the dam's systems through hydraulic pressure. I located the auxiliary gate controls, a set of 3 heavy switches that would temporarily reduce flow through secondary channels, essentially bypassing the main spillway gates and redistributing the discharge. It wasn't standard procedure. It would trigger additional alarms, but it would eliminate the need for immediate visual inspection. At 2:09 a.m., I began throwing switches. The dam's vibration changed immediately. The hum grew deeper, more resonant, as hydraulic systems engaged and water was redirected. New alarms triggered. Yellow lights instead of red, procedural violations rather than safety emergencies. The flow readings on the console began stabilizing as the spillway load decreased. The intercom crackled to life despite being physically disconnected. Multiple voices came through simultaneously, overlapping, some clear and some distant. "Control, what are you doing? Reset those gates immediately. Caleb, you need to check the catwalk. Standard procedure. Stop improvising. Just walk outside. Just look. You've been out there before. It's safe. We need to see the gates. You're making it worse. The readings are wrong because you won't verify them. Go to the catwalk." The voices were urgent, professional, using correct terminology and proper protocols. But they were also wrong. I'd physically disconnected the intercom, and yet it was transmitting. At 2:10 a.m. exactly, the voices stopped. The vibration under my feet changed, slower, heavier, like a massive heartbeat instead of a machine's hum. The lights in the control room dimmed for 3 seconds, then returned to normal. I stayed at the console, hands locked on the edge of the desk, refusing to move. The alarm lights continued flashing. The redistributed flow held steady. The clock ticked forward. 2:11, 2:12, 2:13. Through the window that faced the exterior platform, I could see the catwalk in my peripheral vision. I didn't look directly at it. That felt like exactly the kind of attention that would be dangerous. But I could see its silhouette against the canyon darkness, the narrow metal bridge suspended over the spillway's face. The air above the catwalk was wrong. It shimmered like heat distortion. Except the temperature was near freezing. In that shimmer, shapes moved. Tall, thin, translucent, vaguely human in proportion, but not quite right. They walked back and forth across the catwalk's span, slow and purposeful, pacing a route. 3 figures, maybe 4, difficult to count because they overlapped and blurred together. They were waiting. If I'd gone out there, I would have walked directly into them. At 2:14 a.m., one of the figures turned toward the control room window. I immediately looked away, focusing on the console screens, but I'd glimpsed enough. A pale oval where its face should have been. Dark spots that might have been eyes or might have been empty sockets. A mouth open in an expression frozen between speaking and screaming. The clock advanced. 2:15, 2:16, 2:17. The figures on the catwalk began moving faster, more agitated. The shimmer intensified. I heard a sound through the walls, faint but distinct, like metal under stress, like the catwalk's support cables were being pulled. At 2:18 a.m., something hit the control room window. A single impact, hard enough to rattle the glass. I didn't look. I kept my eyes locked on the console, on the readouts, on anything except the window where something was trying to get my attention. Another impact, then another, like stones being thrown against the glass or fists pounding. 2:19 a.m. The impact stopped, the shimmer faded, the figures on the catwalk became less distinct, dissolving like fog in the wind. 2:20 a.m. The dam's vibration returned to normal. The alarm lights stopped flashing. The system registered that flow had stabilized through the auxiliary channels. The window showed only empty darkness and the catwalk's normal silhouette. I waited another full minute before allowing myself to move. When I finally stood and looked at the exterior window, there was nothing unusual. No marks from impacts, no damage, just clean glass and the reflection of the control room behind me. But when I went to the door that led to the exterior platform and checked it physically, I found scratches on the metal surface. 4 parallel gouges, exactly the width of human fingers, carved into the steel as if it were soft wood. The scratches were on the inside of the door. I returned to the console and manually logged the incident. 2:03, 2:20 a.m. Flow anomaly alert responded to via auxiliary gate protocol. Visual inspection of the spillway was deemed unnecessary due to stabilization through alternative methods. No personnel accessed exterior catwalks, gates functioning within acceptable parameters. It was a bland bureaucratic description that left out everything that actually mattered. At 2:47 a.m., the intercom crackled one final time. "You're learning." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply a voice acknowledging that I'd passed a test, confirming that the entire sequence, the alarm, the contradictory readings, the pressure to go outside, had been orchestrated specifically to see if I would violate Rule 7. I had chosen the rules over the appearance of professional compliance. I had chosen survival protocol over operational protocol. And for tonight, that was enough. The rest of the shift was genuinely quiet. The dam settled into its normal routine, as if satisfied that its boundaries had been tested and held. When I walked the interior corridor at 4 a.m. for my standard equipment check, the lights were all functional, the space was empty, and my footsteps echoed normally. Marlowe arrived at 6:02, He looked at the console logs, at the auxiliary gate controls still in their modified positions, at the official incident report I'd written. Then he looked at me. "You didn't go outside." "No, even though the system told you to." The rule was clear. He studied the door to the exterior platform, ran his finger along the scratches in the metal. "These weren't here yesterday." "No." He nodded slowly. "You made the right choice. The flow anomaly was manufactured. The gates are fine. I'll verify that this morning. It was testing whether you'd trust the rules or trust your training." He poured coffee with steady hands. "Most people trust their training. Most people go outside to quickly verify the situation. Most people don't come back the same. What happens to them? Different things. Some fall. Some come back inside but won't speak about what they saw, and they quit within 24 hours. One operator came back and seemed fine, but he'd changed. Started violating other rules, started doing things that made no sense, like he was following instructions only he could hear. We had to remove him for his own safety." Marlowe set his coffee down. "The dam isn't trying to kill you specifically, Navarro. It's trying to establish contact, trying to find someone who'll lower the boundary and let what's below come through. Every night operator is a test subject. Most fail. A few survive by staying behind the rules, and very occasionally someone like you comes along who understands that survival means accepting you'll never know what would have happened if you'd done things differently. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true." He glanced at the clock. "Get some sleep. You've earned it." I went to my quarters and lay down fully clothed, too exhausted to do more than close my eyes. Sleep came immediately, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep your body demands after sustained terror. When I woke, it was early evening, and I had a voicemail on my phone from the regional office. The message was brief. They'd received my 3-week performance report from Marlowe, and they were pleased with my adaptation to the position. They were approving a permanent assignment if I chose to accept it. I listened to the message twice, trying to decide if 3 weeks at Eagle Crest constituted success or simply the absence of failure. Then I deleted it and began preparing for my 11th night. The days after the catwalk incident were deceptive. The dam grew quiet, not silent, never silent, but quiet enough that I could almost convince myself things were stabilizing. My shifts fell into a rhythm. The rules became second nature. I learned the subtle differences between normal mechanical sounds and the ones that meant something else was moving through the structure. I learned not to look at reflections after midnight. I learned which shadows were just shadows and which ones held depth that shouldn't exist. I started to believe I was adapting. That belief lasted 12 days. On my 22nd night, I arrived for my shift to find Marlowe still in the control room at 11:47 p.m. He was standing at the window overlooking the reservoir, his posture tense in a way I'd never seen. "Something wrong?" I asked. He didn't turn. "Look at the reservoir. Tell me what you see." I joined him at the window. Outside, the night was clear, unusual for late November in the mountains. The sky was bright with stars, the canyon walls visible as black silhouettes against the faint celestial glow. The reservoir spread out before us, vast and dark, and the water was perfectly still. Not just calm, not just smooth. Still in a way that water should never be, like a sheet of black glass without the faintest ripple, without any suggestion of current or wind or the subtle movements that even the stillest lake displays. It looked less like water and more like a void, a perfectly flat surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "How long has it been like this?" I asked. "Since about 9 p.m. 3 hours now." Marlowe's voice was tight. "I've been watching. It hasn't moved once. No wind ripples, no thermal currents, nothing." I checked the weather monitoring system. Wind at the dam site, 7 miles per hour northwest, temperature 29 degrees. Normal conditions should have been producing at least minor surface chop on the reservoir. Is this... I hesitated, not sure how to phrase the question. Is this something that happens? It's happened twice before in my time here, once in 1998, once in 2009. He finally turned to look at me. Both times we lost the night operator within a week. My mouth went dry. How? Different ways. First time the operator quit after 3 days, said he couldn't stand it anymore, refused to explain what it was. Moved out of state, wouldn't return calls. Second time the operator followed all the rules perfectly but started seeing things even during day hours. Started saying the dam was showing him people he knew. Eventually he had to be hospitalized. Psychiatric facility. He's still there as far as I know. I looked back at the reservoir. The stillness was hypnotic. Wrong in a fundamental way that made my hindbrain scream danger even though nothing was visibly threatening. What does it mean? I asked. Near as I can figure, it means the dam is fully focused, all its attention, all its energy concentrated and ready. The stillness is like... He searched for words. Like when a predator stops moving before it strikes, or like the air pressure before a storm, it's a gathering. Of what? Pressure, intent, whatever you want to call what's held down there. He picked up his jacket. I'm not staying past midnight, neither should you. Call in sick, take a few days, let this pass. If I leave, what happens to the dam? Who monitors it? It runs automatically for short periods. The turbines are self-regulating. The gates have automated safeties. It'll be fine for 72 hours. He paused at the door. But if you stay, follow every rule perfectly. No exceptions, no close calls, no assumptions. Treat tonight like the dam is actively hunting for mistakes. He left at 11:54. I stood alone in the control room watching the clock tick toward midnight, watching the impossible stillness of the water outside. At 12 a.m. precisely, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Text message from a number I didn't recognize. Check your personal email, attachment, open it. I knew immediately this was part of whatever was happening. But curiosity, that dangerous, persistent human failing, made me pull out the laptop I kept in my quarters and boot it up. One new email, from an address that was just random characters. No subject line, one attachment, a video file, labeled only with a date, 1967-03-17. I shouldn't have opened it. Every instinct told me not to. But I thought about what Marlowe had said about operators who saw things even during day hours, about people who broke even when they followed the rules. And I realized that sometimes the dam didn't need you to violate rules. It just needed to get inside your head and wait for you to break yourself. So if it was trying to show me something, I'd rather see it on my terms than have it surprise me later. I opened the file. The video was grainy, clearly transferred from old film. It showed an aerial view of Stillwater Valley, houses arranged along orderly streets, the white church prominent on a small rise, the river running through the town center. The color was washed out, the quality poor, but you could see cars parked on streets, laundry hanging in yards, and a dog running across someone's lawn. Normal. A living town. Then the perspective shifted. The camera was moving, probably mounted on a helicopter or plane. It swept over the town's perimeter, showing the earth-moving equipment staged in the canyon, the partially constructed dam rising at the valley's narrow end, and the temporary cofferdam that was holding back the river. The timestamp in the corner changed. Days passed in seconds. The cofferdam was removed. Water began entering the valley. I watched as the town drowned in time-lapse. The river spread first, reclaiming its original floodplain, swallowing the parks and the lower streets. The water was brown with silt, moving slowly but inexorably. Cars were relocated. Houses on the periphery were submerged to their roofs. The water kept rising. Day by day, the town disappeared. The residential areas went first, rooftops vanishing beneath the murky surface. Then the commercial district. Then everything except the church on its small rise, which stood alone for 3 more days, water lapping at its steps before it too was swallowed. The video should have ended there. A time-lapse of planned flooding, interesting in a historical way, but nothing supernatural. Instead, it continued. The perspective zoomed in on the submerged town, somehow showing beneath the surface despite the silty water. And what I saw made my skin crawl. The buildings were still there, structures intact, preserved in the airless depth. But there were lights in the windows, faint phosphorescent glows like bioluminescence or swamp gas, but arranged too regularly to be natural. The lights were in house windows, in the church, in the stores along Main Street. And shapes were moving in those buildings. Human-proportioned silhouettes, visible only as darker shadows against the faint light, go through routines. A figure walking back and forth in what had been a house. Multiple figures gathered in what had been the church. Shapes moving along the submerged streets, following the paths where sidewalks had been. The timestamp kept advancing. Weeks, months, years. The footage should have been impossible. No one was filming the reservoir floor continuously for decades, but it kept playing, showing the drowned town in its preservation, showing the lights that never went out and the shapes that never stopped their routines. Then the perspective pulled back, and I saw the dam from above, the massive concrete wedge holding back the water, the control building attached to its eastern flank like a parasite, and beneath the water the grid of lights that marked where still water had been. The lights were pulsing now, all together. A slow rhythm that looked organic, looked like breathing. The video ended. I sat staring at the blank screen, my hands shaking. The file's date, 1967 or 3/17, was weeks before the reservoir had finished filling. The time-lapse had shown years that hadn't happened yet. The video was impossible, which meant it wasn't a video. It was a message. I closed the laptop and returned to the control room. The reservoir was still perfectly glassed beyond the windows, still impossibly motionless. My phone buzzed again. Another text. They're not gone. They're held. The dam keeps them. The water remembers their shape. You stand at the threshold. You could open it. You could let them equalize. You could release the pressure. I didn't respond. I set the phone face down and turned my attention to the console, to the routine checks, to the familiar rhythm of monitoring and logging. But the words stayed in my head. You could open it. Because I could. The dam had manual overrides for everything, gates, turbines, drainage systems. If I wanted to catastrophically fail the structure, if I wanted to release the reservoir in an uncontrolled flood, I technically had the authority and access to initiate that sequence. It would take several deliberate actions, multiple fail-safes would have to be manually bypassed. But it was physically possible. And some part of me, the part that had seen the drowned town's lights, that had heard the voices and felt the presence and understood that something was suffering in the deep, some part of me wondered if that would actually be mercy. If the release might end whatever had been trapped here since 1967. I picked up the rule clipboard and found the note I'd written on my 4th night, copied from one of the oldest entries in the hidden folder. The dam isn't haunted. It's not that simple. It's more like it's remembering. The concrete holds pressure, yes, but it also holds something else. Memory. Intention, the weight of what was displaced. You stand at the threshold. You could open it. At 2:47 a.m., I walked to the manual control panel. I stood in front of the large industrial switches that controlled the primary gates. I put my hand on the cold metal of the emergency release. the master override that would initiate a full drainage sequence. I stood there for 90 seconds imagining what would happen if I pulled it. The reservoir is emptying, the valley revealed. The town was exposed to air for the first time in 56 years. Whatever was held down there freed. 40,000 homes would lose power, the downstream basin would flood, infrastructure would be destroyed, people would die. Not the people who drowned in 1967, but real people, living people who depended on the dam's continued operation. I took my hand off the switch. "No," I said aloud. "I'm not opening anything." The dam's vibration changed instantly, a spike of intensity like a surge of anger or frustration, then a gradual settling. The lights dimmed for 3 seconds, then everything returned to normal. My phone buzzed one final time. "Then you're alone." I picked up the phone and threw it across the room. It hit the wall and fell silent. The rest of the shift was quiet, but the quality of that quiet had changed. Before, the silence had felt watchful, attentive, like the dam was monitoring me to find weakness. Now it felt dismissive, like I'd been evaluated and categorized and filed away. I'd been offered a choice, maybe the test I'd really been building towards since the first night, and I'd refused it. I'd chosen the living over the dead, the present over the past, maintenance over resolution. I didn't know if that was right, but it was what I'd chosen. When Marlowe arrived at dawn, the reservoir was still glass smooth. He looked at it for a long moment, then at me. "You made it through." "Barely." "That's enough." He checked the logs, the systems, running through his morning verification routine. "The stillness will pass, usually takes a day or two. Then things go back to baseline, back to normal haunting, back to manageable haunting." He poured coffee. "You'll stay?" I thought about the offer that had been made in the darkness, about release and pressure and the weight of things held too long underwater, about the fact that I'd refused, and that refusal meant accepting that this situation would never end, never improve, never offer resolution. "I'll stay," I said, "for now. That's all anyone can promise here." He raised his coffee cup slightly, a small toast. "To survive." "To survival," I echoed. I went to my quarters and slept through the day. My dreams were full of submerged buildings and lights that pulsed like breathing. But when I woke, I was still at Eagle Crest, still intact, still on the side of the threshold where the living belonged. 2 days later, the reservoir's surface began moving again, small ripples spreading from the wind, the normal behavior of water responding to atmospheric conditions. The period of stillness had passed, but I found one final addition to the rule sheet that night, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Not mine, not Marlowe's, thin and spidery like something done with a shaking hand. Rule 11. If the reservoir ever looks lower than it should be on a clear night, do not go closer to check. It is not actually lower. It is closer. Neither Marlowe nor I had written it. The control room doors had been locked all day. There was no explanation for how the note had appeared. But I added it to my personal rule sheet anyway because at Eagle Crest you didn't question the warnings. You just followed them. I worked at Eagle Crest Dam for 4 more months before requesting a transfer. That might not sound like much, barely half a year at a job. But in Eagle Crest terms, it was an achievement. By the time I filed my transfer paperwork, I was the 4th longest-serving night operator in the dam's 56-year history. Only 3 people had lasted longer, the operator who'd worked there from 1975 to 1981 before dying of a heart attack at age 53, the one who'd managed 7 years in the 80s before transferring to a desk position and refusing to discuss his time at the dam, and Marlowe, who'd been there in various capacities for 3 decades and showed no signs of leaving. 4 months meant 124 nights. 124 shifts of the following rules, monitoring boundaries, maintaining the threshold between what was held down and what was permitted to surface. 124 cycles of tension building and releasing, tests administered and passed, narrow escapes from mistakes I almost made. I lasted because I never got comfortable, because I treated every single night as if it were my first night, cautious, vigilant, assuming nothing. Because I followed the rules with religious precision and added to them whenever I learned something new. By the time I left, the laminated rule sheet had become a document covered in annotations. My handwriting, Marlowe's additions, the occasional note that appeared without authorship. Some nights I'd find a new line written at the bottom of my personal copy, a warning in unfamiliar script about a situation I'd never encountered but someone else clearly had. If the turbine hum becomes rhythmic enough to sound like language, leave the control room for 10 minutes. Do not try to understand what it's saying. The rules had become a conversation across time, each operator leaving messages for their successors, building a collective knowledge base maintained by people who shared one thing in common. They'd all stood where I stood and chose survival over curiosity. But survival came with costs. I developed the damn stare that Marlowe had, a habit of keeping part of my attention on water even when I was nowhere near Eagle Crest. At restaurants, I'd find myself watching the condensation patterns on drinking glasses. At home in town, I'd stare at the shower stream looking for faces in the spray. I stopped being able to swim. Something about full immersion in water triggered panic attacks. I had trouble sleeping even during the day. I'd wake at 2:17 a.m. regardless of whether I was on shift, my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard knocking. I stopped listening to the radio because certain frequencies would suddenly sound like the dam's intercom, like voices calling from somewhere they shouldn't be. The worst was the isolation. How could I explain to anyone what I'd experienced? How could I describe the rules to someone who hadn't felt the weight of attention from something vast and patient and utterly inhuman? I tried once at a bar in town talking to a woman who'd asked about my job. I got 3 sentences in, "There are rules about when you can't cross certain catwalks," before I saw the look in her eyes and stopped. Polite concern. The expression people wear when they're deciding whether someone needs professional help. I stopped trying to explain after that. In my 4th month, the regional office contacted me about a day shift supervisor position at a water treatment facility near Denver. Standard operations, no night work, closer to civilization. Better pay, better hours, better everything by every objective measure. I accepted immediately. Marlowe didn't seem surprised when I told him. We were in the control room during a shift handoff, the morning light just beginning to gray the eastern sky. 4 months is respectable, he said. You did well. I feel like I'm abandoning something. You're not. You're recognizing your limits. That's smart, not cowardly. He refilled his coffee. Most people break or run within weeks. You lasted long enough to really understand what this place is, to respect it. That matters. Will you tell the next operator? Pass on what I learned? I'll do what I always do. I'll give them the rules, watch how they respond, and decide how much they can handle knowing. He looked at me directly. Not everyone can handle the full truth. Some people need to discover it gradually. You were the discovering type. You went looking, you found the hidden folder, you asked questions. The next person might be different. Might need protecting from themselves until they're ready. I spent my last 2 weeks at Eagle Crest documenting everything I'd learned. I wrote detailed notes about specific times and locations that seemed more active than others. I described the particular quality of sounds that meant something was wrong versus sounds that were just the dam being the dam. I added recommendations about which rules were absolute and which had slight flexibility in certain circumstances. I attached my documentation to the hidden folder in the filing cabinet, adding my voice to the chorus of warnings that had accumulated over decades. On my final shift, night 124, I performed my duties with meticulous care, as if the dam might punish me with one last test if I showed any presumption of safety. But the night was quiet. The reservoir sat at normal levels, rippling gently in the wind. The equipment functioned without anomaly. The interior corridors remained empty except for me. It felt almost like a farewell, like whatever inhabited Eagle Crest recognized I was leaving and was granting me safe passage. At 5:47 a.m., as I was preparing to hand off to Marlowe for the last time, I found a final note on my personal rule sheet. It was in the spidery handwriting that occasionally appeared, the one that wasn't mine or Marlowe's, the one I'd never identified. Rule 12. If you start seeing buildings in the water that were never really there, it has learned what you regret. Do not try to fix it. You cannot reverse displacement. You cannot restore what was compressed. You can only maintain the boundary and witness what remains. I read it 3 times, understanding it was speaking directly to me, to the part of me that still wondered if I should have pulled the emergency release, if I should have chosen release over containment. The rule was telling me that the choice had been false, that opening the gates wouldn't have freed anyone, wouldn't have restored anything, would only have broken the equilibrium that kept both sides separated. I folded the rule sheet and left it on the console for whoever came next. Marlowe arrived at 6 Ornox exactly. We spent 30 minutes doing the formal handoff, equipment status, ongoing issues, maintenance schedules, professional and procedural, as if this were any normal shift change. As I gathered my personal belongings from my quarters, he knocked on the doorframe. "One last thing," he said. "You did better than most. You understood that the dam isn't evil, it's not malicious. It's just holding pressure that needs to be held. And sometimes the pressure finds cracks, finds weak points, and you have to shore up the boundary. That's all we do here, shore up boundaries." "Why do you stay?" I asked. "Really?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because someone has to remember, someone has to bear witness to what's down there. All those people who were displaced, who died, who got trapped in the compression, someone needs to acknowledge they existed, that they're still there in some form, that their refusal to leave meant something." He looked out the small window toward the reservoir. "I'm too old to start over. And honestly, I made peace with this place a long time ago. It's my burden now, my responsibility. Leaving would feel like betrayal." I understood that. The dam had its hooks in him, not through fear, but through obligation, through the weight of witness. We shook hands. I left the control building, walked to my car, and drove up the switchback road without looking back. By the time I reached the canyon rim, the sun had fully risen, and Eagle Crest Dam was a gray slash in the landscape below, holding back its dark reservoir, patient and eternal. I started my new position in Denver 3 weeks later. The water treatment facility was everything Eagle Crest wasn't: brightly lit, fully staffed, surrounded by suburbs, operating under normal physical laws. The work was easy, the co-workers were friendly, I had weekends off and health benefits and a retirement plan. I hated every minute of it, not because it was bad, but because it felt insubstantial. Like I was going through the motions of a normal life while the real work, the important work, was happening somewhere else, attended to by someone else, night after night in a control room I'd never see again. The damn stare never went away. Neither did the 2:17 a.m. wake-ups. Neither did the instinct to check reflections for things that shouldn't be there. 3 months after I left, Marlowe called. "Thought you should know. We've got a new night operator. Started 2 weeks ago. How are they doing?" "Still here. That's something. Young, mid-20s, eager to prove themselves. Came from an engineering background. Lots of confidence in systems and protocols. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety. Have they tested any rules yet? Not seriously. Had a close call with the exterior lights. Wanted to inspect for electrical faults at 1:30 a.m. I shut that down fast. Reinforced that the rules aren't suggestions. He paused. Name's Riley. Reminds me of you, actually. Smart, questioning. The type who'll go looking for the hidden folder within a week. Tell Riley I left notes, in the folder. Everything I learned. I will. Another pause. You doing okay, Navarro? Settling in? I'm fine. The new job's fine. You're a terrible liar. I heard him exhale. It gets easier. The transition. Takes about 6 months before you stop checking every shadow. A year before you sleep through the night consistently, but it does get better. Does it? No, he admitted. But that's what I tell people. We talked for a few more minutes. Updates about equipment, weather patterns, and minor incidents that didn't escalate. The conversation of people who'd shared an experience no one else could understand. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, bright, clean, safe, and thought about Riley. Thought about someone new standing in the control room watching the reservoir go dark, hearing the first anomalous sounds and deciding whether they were real or imagined. Thought about the rules waiting to be discovered and tested and followed or broken. Thought about the cycle continuing year after year, operator after operator, each one adding their small voice to the accumulated wisdom of survival. The dam had been there since 1967. It would be there long after I was gone, after Marlowe was gone, after Riley and whoever came after Riley. The concrete would hold. The water would press against it. And something in the depths would continue its patient work of testing boundaries, looking for cracks, waiting for the operator who would finally give it the opening it needed. I hoped Riley was smart. I hoped Riley was careful. I hoped Riley would last longer than I had, would add their own notes to the hidden folder, would pass on the lessons and maintain the threshold. Because someone had to stand in that control room. Someone had to keep the boundary. Someone had to bear witness to what was held in the deep. It was the only thing keeping the pressure contained. The only thing preventing whatever waited in the drowned town from finally equalizing, finally rising, finally reclaiming the surface that had been taken from it 56 years ago. I thought about calling Riley. Leaving a message, offering advice, providing direct contact with someone who'd walked the same path. But I didn't, because part of the job was learning for yourself, discovering your own limits, finding your own way to survive the nights. All I could do was hope the rules would be enough. And know that somewhere in the mountains, in a control room built into concrete, the clipboard was waiting. The laminated sheet is covered in annotations. The accumulated wisdom of decades of night operators who'd chosen survival over understanding, maintenance over resolution, boundaries over release. Rule 1 through Rule 12, and all the unwritten ones besides. The rules that had kept me alive, the rules that would keep Riley alive, the rules that would keep the dam's hungry patience contained for one more night, and another after that. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was opening the door. And no one who'd ever done that had come back to write the rule about what happened next. I turned off the lights in my apartment and tried to sleep, knowing I'd wake at 2:17 a.m. with the taste of concrete dust in my mouth and the sound of water against metal echoing in my dreams. Far away in a canyon in Colorado, the reservoir sat dark and still, holding its secrets in the cold and the deep, patient as only something dead and displaced can be. And in the control room, Riley was just beginning to understand that the job posting had left out the most important detail. You weren't operating the dam. You were negotiating with it. Every single night. for as long as you could last.